All right, thank you, Tamam. Very helpful introduction. So I think I will just briefly share my screen, and I am praying for technological success here. Okay, great. So I have a brief discussion or a brief presentation to share with you afterwards, but I thought it would be a bit more fun to start first with something a little bit more interactive. So I have set up a little Mentimeter poll here that we can use to kick off the conversation about the kinds of crises that MSF might face in the future. So the question of the Mentimeter is, what is the biggest issue that MSF will face 15 years from now? I don't know, maybe you think it's climate change or perhaps AI taking over the world. But there's a QR code at the bottom left that can allow you to put in your answer. And please only answer the first question that comes up. Don't go to the second one, because that the second one is for the end of this this discussion. Okay, we've got mis and disinformation, definitely. Big problem, reputationally and otherwise. All right, we've got climate change, of course. Nationalism. Oh, internal bureaucracy, that's a good one. I see pandemics. The politicization of aid, a huge deal for MSF and other organizations in our space. Let's see, financial problems, illiberalism, death of the liberal world order and all. Huge needs, definitely. Nationalization programs. Quite an interesting list. That is insecurity. Okay, sorry, the list is moving a little too fast for me to read it. You've got population displacement, something that I think is very well connected to climate change. All right, I think so. This is a good place for us to start. And I wish that I could start by I wish I could start this conversation by saying that I had a method for us to deal with all of these problems, but I don't. However, what I do have is a method that we can use to consider them and to begin the process of preparing ourselves to face these problems that will come up more in the medium to long-term future than in the immediate future. So thank you for your contributions to the Menti. I think you can pause the responses now. And please excuse my multi-part presentation format. Can somebody give me a yes if you can now see the PowerPoint instead of the Menti? Yes, okay, great. So I am here to share with you a little bit about future crises. So as I mentioned before, I have been working with MSF for the past few months to implement exactly the pilot program that Tamam just described, to investigate capacity for a new way that MSF can consider the possible futures of the world that we will eventually work in. And this is not the only program of its kind. There are other programs in other sectors, elsewhere in the humanitarian sector and beyond, that go by many names. Sometimes they're called strategic foresight programs or future thinking programs. But something that I really want to stress, that's important to understand, is that all of these programs grow out of or derive from the same academic discipline. And that academic discipline is called future studies. So what is future studies? In the same way that biology is the study of life and mathematics is the study of math, futures studies is the study of possible futures that might occur in the world. So for the most of human history, efforts to understand the future have primarily been conceived of as a religious or an astrological process, where people, usually holy individuals of some kind, look to the stars or other natural phenomena in order to understand what might happen in the future. And for the most part, in this version of understanding the future, that knowledge wasn't challenged in what we would now perceive as a type of academic methodology or an academic review. It was really in the 20th century that humanity's relationship with the future had an important development, which is that probably around the 1950s and beyond is when various companies and institutions and actors all over the world started investing in ways to look at the future as an academic and evidence-based discipline, to remove it from its original religious and astrological concepts and make a methodology about it that can provide knowledge that is useful for decision makers when trying to position themselves for the changing realities of the future. Now, an important caveat about future studies, actually the most important caveat, is that no methodology within this canon claims to be able to produce a clear 100% true vision of the future. That's impossible, and it's also not the purpose of the field. The purpose of future studies is to envision the futures that might happen, the possible scenarios that we might face in the future, so that we can begin the process of preparing for them. It is a tool that decision makers in the present can use to allocate resources to better prepare us for the things that we might face down the road. So I think it helps to give a practical example. There are many different methodologies included in the future studies canon, and one of them, a particularly popular one, is called a futures wheel. And just as for transparency, this is actually not the method that we used in this pilot program because it was not quite the right method to answer the exact questions that we were asking. But it is a useful way of explaining what future studies is about and what its purpose is. So the premise of a futures wheel is that you begin with a central decision, event, or trend in the future. Then you gather a group of individuals, usually experts of some kind, to first identify what are the immediate first order impacts of that decision, event, or trend. And you list those in a circle outside of the central circle. Then you repeat the exercise for the second order impacts. Essentially, what are the results of the results? And in theory, you can repeat the exercise as concentric circles pretty much an infinite number of times. So what is the potential value of an exercise like this for a humanitarian organization? So as a practical example, I was kind of poking around in some journals and other publications, and I found a futures wheel. It's a bit of a complicated diagram that was specifically about the COVID-19 pandemic. And I know there's a lot to look at here, but zoom in a bit and take a look at the first order impacts in the darkest gray circle in the middle. So among first order impacts, they predicted social distancing, rapid medical research, data mining, place-based lockdowns, travel bans, closure of borders, loss of individual freedoms, and the closure of schools. Then in the next widest circle, slightly less darker gray, they predicted everything from the delivery of online learning and remote working to the cancellation of cultural events and tourism, to extra police. Oop, sorry, I briefly dropped off. Are you able to hear?
We can hear you again now.
Hear you now.
Okay, sorry, my Zoom closed and reopened. Okay, I reshare. All right, so in the third order impacts in the largest circle, they predicted everything from increased deaths to job losses, government stimulus packages, highly stressed families and mental health support. And, looking at this diagram, it contains so much detailed information that you might think that it's some kind of retrospective exercise, but actually this diagram was produced in March of 2020 by a group of future studies experts and public health experts in Australia. And I gotta say, they got a lot right. There's a lot of very rich and detailed information in here about possible trajectories of the pandemic. And for the most part, all of it actually came true. And not all futures wheel exercises or other future studies exercises can claim to be so accurate. There's no such guarantee of success. But looking at a diagram like this, you can kind of start to see the potential value of these methodologies for organizations in the humanitarian and health sector. So in particular, I mean, looking at something like the COVID pandemic, it really started to have major impacts on the world in the beginning of 2020. And at that time, personally, I wasn't yet working at MSF, but my understanding of that time was that there was a lot of really fast moving and complicated conversations about what MSF's response to the pandemic should be. Where are we best positioned to have impact? And I guess I submit that exercises like this can be a useful tool for decision makers in MSF to understand the possible trajectories of the pandemic, so that we can best identify quickly how we can have impact and also the biggest risks that we face in doing so. And it's not that MSF doesn't already have decision-making processes in place to consider these kinds of things. It's more that these types of future studies exercises are a very powerful and efficient augmentative tool to those existing processes. I really want to stress that Future Crises is not in any way a replacement for the planning structures that we already have as an organization. It is an augmentative tool to make those planning structures even more efficient and effective, and to help broaden the time horizon in which we can investigate the possibilities of the future. So it's, I think, also worth mentioning that future studies is gaining a lot of popularity in the humanitarian and health sector. So just to name a couple of examples, in 2022, the WHO published a manual on the use of foresight approaches in public health. And basically, this was a manual that they published for their own employees who wanted to use these types of methodologies to look at epidemiological futures and the future of public health events. And in 2021, the Red Cross launched their own strategic foresight initiative, which was actually, to my understanding, first launched as a pilot very similar to this one, and now survives as a standing research program called ForTech, which uses these methodologies to investigate the future of technologies with humanitarian implications. And yeah, I think it's worth saying that just because other organizations in our space are doing something doesn't necessarily mean that MSF should also do that. But it's good context to know that if MSF decides to invest in this capacity, we're not reinventing the wheel or creating a new research discipline from scratch. We are joining a growing community of other organizations, both in our space and far beyond, that are using these tools as a mechanism to help prepare for a very quickly changing future, and to prepare for the fact that the time horizon of change in human society is vastly decreasing. Changes are coming much quicker than they used to. So this is a powerful preparatory tool for us to do that. So you may be wondering, what did we actually do in this pilot? What has been going on in the last few months? And so I will just briefly go over sort of what our methods were, and also our research question. So our research question was essentially, what it boils down to is, can future studies methodologies produce knowledge that's actually useful for MSF? Is this a tool that can efficiently help us come to these decisions about how we allocate our resources in the present? Can it produce knowledge that MSF decision makers find valuable? So in terms of our methods, Future Crises, as Timon mentioned, has an advisory board, and that advisory board met in January to select 2 topics that we considered to be of use for investigation in this pilot program. The first topic selected was future pandemics after COVID, in particular with a focus on the impact of pandemics on large-scale refugee settings. And we actually used Cox's Bazar as an example case study for this. And the second topic was urban conflict, how urban conflict might change in the future in ways that would affect how MSF operates in those spaces. To actually conduct the research, we had 2 participatory research workshops here at MSF Holland. The first one was virtual, and the second was held face-to-face here in the office. In terms of composition, each workshop had 15 participants. Half of the participants were MSFers, and half were externals that we invited from various humanitarian organizations, research institutions, academia, and NGOs. And mainly the participants were selected based on their knowledge background concerning the topics of the workshop. The primary methodology of these workshops was scenario planning, which is a future studies methodology that focuses on the creation of possible scenarios that take place in the future. The idea is to gather experts to combine knowledge to use existing knowledge to generate possible scenarios, and then talk through those scenarios and the impact that they could have on us. So these methodologies are, this is only one methodology in a larger canon, but it was the one that we selected for this workshop, or for this pilot program, because we thought it created a very useful space for the combination of knowledge of many different interdisciplinary experts. So I honestly, I find these methodologies so fascinating, and I could go on about them at length, but I've already been talking at length. And I think that to make this a bit more interesting, it would be better to hear about both our methods and our outcomes from some of the people who participated in this research process. And we've invited a few of them here to share a bit about their experience participating in future crises from a variety of different angles.